Hey everybody. I have COVID and I'm recording outside, so this recording may be a little rough. This is chapter 10 from Norman Levine's The Tragic Deception, Marx, Contra, Engels. The chapter is titled The Origins of Economic Determinism. Based upon the preceding discussion of Engels' philosophy of nature, it is logical to expect his philosophy of history to be equally deterministic. Such was indeed the case. The internal rationality of Engels' thought moved from a mechanistic materialist view of the universe to a deterministic view of human history. This chapter will demonstrate that it was Engels, not Marx, who was the originator of economic determinism. It will also demonstrate what Engels meant by economics was really invention, machinery, tools. I want to repeat that sentence because it's really, really, really important, and this is kind of like I think that last sentence kind of discusses kind of covers the general intellectual trajectory of large swaths of subsequent Marxism in the 20th century. This chapter will, I'm going to repeat it, this chapter will also demonstrate that what Engels meant by economics was really invention, machinery, tools. Human history for Engels had moved on a global scale through a fixed series of evolutionary stages. All societies, regardless of location, must evolve in a four-stage sequence from primitive communism to feudalism to capitalism to communism. Engels recognized that there could be local variations to this pattern. Although the general law would always predominate at the end, there could be specific modifications during this inevitable development. Engels was a unilinear evolutionist. In The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels attempted to solve two interrelated problems, the rise of monogamy and the rise of the state. Engels received most of his factual data on these matters from the notes that Marx took on the book Ancient Society by the famous American anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan. From both the Marx notes and some other reading Engels did on the primitive condition of mankind, Engels learned that before monogamous society had come into being, Gentile society had existed. The Gentile organization of society was based on mother right. Descent was traced through the matriarchal line. The gens was composed of all those children who could claim descent from a common mother. Within the gens, property was owned communally. Furthermore, political life within the gens was highly democratic, with decisions arrived at by an entire assemblage of the gens. In effect, the gens was a primitive form of communism, where private property did not exist, where direct participatory democracy was practiced, and where both practices were direct consequences of the matriarchal constitution, kinship through the female. The problem that Engels tried to resolve was the mechanisms by which Gentile society had been overthrown. Engels sought to account for the destruction of matriarchal society and the coming into being of a monogamous society based on the rights of the father. The origin of patriarchic monogamy was due solely, in Engels' eyes, to the acquisition of private property. As soon as the male won exclusive possession over property, possession of the herds, arising out of the division of labor where women did agricultural work and men pastured the herd. The male had to invent a form of marriage that would ensure that his inheritance would pass to his sons alone, father right, patriarchic monogamy. The causal factor in the destruction of the Gentile constitution, according to Engels, was economic. The revolutionizing force was property, or a material productive social agent. Engels used the same line of argument when he tried to solve his second problem, the origin of the state. The determining factor in the rise of the state was also economic. Engels accounted for the rise of the Athenian and Roman states as a two-stage development. Patriarchic monogamy arose from the basis of private property, and the state arose from the basis of patriarchic monogamy. The state and male domination, two kinds of authoritarianism, were coexistent. The state developed because the Gentile constitution could no longer reconcile the differences that had developed within itself. Economic conditions had compelled the gens to split into rich and poor. A third force was needed to suppress the open conflict between propertied and propertyless classes. This third force was the state, an organ of oppression to be used in the interests of the wealthy. Engels, however, did not limit his investigations to the overthrow of the Gentile order or the birth of the state in Greece. Engels was seeking a more universal law. Engels was attempting to discover a general principle for the development of the family on a worldwide basis. In The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels outlined an anthropological parallelism. Engels attempted to show how the, quote, three principal forms of marriage, end quote, perfectly corresponded, quote, to the three principal stages of human development, end quote. In the period of savagery, man lived a basically tribal and nomadic existence, and in this stage, group marriage was practiced. In the period of barbarism, man learned to domesticate animals and undertake agriculture, and in this stage, the Gentile constitution was in practice. Lastly, in the period of civilization, man developed some technological and industrial skills, and in this stage, the monogamous family came to be the norm. At all times, however, the form of the family, the most nuclear human social relationship, was dependent upon a definite stage of human productivity. In The Origin, then, Engels outlined a three-stage developmental pattern for the human family that was applicable on a universal scale. Engels thus demonstrated that he was a unilinear evolutionist. Engels maintained that it was a universal law that a certain stage of economic development would produce a certain form of family structure. The following passage from The Origin clearly illustrates this point, quote, "But chance is only the one pole of a relation whose pole is named, quote, necessity," end quote. In the world of nature, where chance also seems to rule, we have long since demonstrated in each separate field the inner necessity and law asserting itself in this chance. But what is true of the natural world is true also of society. The more a social activity, a series of social processes, becomes too powerful for men's conscious control and grows above their heads, and the more it appears a matter of pure chance, then all the more surely within this chance the laws peculiar to it and inherent in it assert themselves as if by natural necessity. Such laws also govern the changes of commodity production and exchange to the individuals producing or exchanging. They appear as alien and at first often unrecognized powers, whose nature must first be laboriously investigated and established. These economic laws of commodity production are modified with the various stages of this form of production, but in general the whole period of civilization is dominated by them. I want to repeat that sentence, because that's very, very important right there in trying to distinguish the specificities of Engels' thinking, because this is not something that Marx would say. These economic laws of commodity production are modified with the various stages of this form of production, but in general the whole period of civilization is dominated by them, end quote. When Engels wrote of the economic, the center of gravity of that definition was always the technological. Machinery, social productivity were the most important forces in all societies. Therefore, as the tools and industrial infrastructure of society changed, so the form of the family of necessity changed. As technology and economic productivity moved through various stages of development, so social forms and customs evolved through corresponding unilinear stages. Engels manifested the same group of principles when he speculated on the nature of history in Anti-Düring. In this book, he interpreted the human past from the perspective of 6 principles to which he was unalterably bound. 1. The necessary causal agent for economic and social evolution was technological change. 2. Technological change proceeded in a deterministic and necessary fashion. 3. Economic and social change paralleled, conformed to, and was dependent upon technological change. 4. Since technological change was deterministic and necessary, so social change must be deterministic and necessary. 5. All societies must conform to a general line of evolution, a unilinear path of development. 6. These rules of historical development are natural laws of the physical universe. These 6 principles, taken together, constitute what Engels understood as Marxism. One second, I gotta take a picture of this passage because it's very important. Sorry, I know this is irritating. Sorry about that. I know that's yucky to listen to, I'm sure. Alright. In Part 2, Chapter 3 of Anti-During, Engels briefly sketched some of the more important military events of Western Europe from the 14th century until the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. In the 14th century, gunpowder was introduced by the Arabs to Western Europe. With gunpowder came cannon and firearms, and the political relations of domination and subjection in the feudal world were completely altered. The thick castle walls of the nobility were no longer impregnable, and the armor-clad cavalry of the feudal barons could be pierced. Armed with cannon and musket, the bourgeoisie could support their political claims with military power. In the early 19th century, the column replaced the rigid mathematical line formations of the 18th century. The column imparted speed and maneuverability to military strategy, both tactics being exploited to the fullest by Napoleon Bonaparte. But before the column could become a reality, two technological inventions were necessary. Gribeauval invented lighter carriages for field guns, and this increased their capacity for rapid movement, and the slanting of the butt on rifles greatly increased their accuracy. Prussia was the next country to make a military breakthrough. The breech-loading rifle, which it perfected between 1830 and 1860, enormously increased the firepower and the accuracy of the infantry. In describing some of the military turning points in the history of Europe since the 11th century, Engels clearly made technological change the most important agent of this development. Engels wrote that nothing was, quote, more dependent on economic preconditions than precisely the army and navy, end quote. But here Engels showed that he was prone to use terms inaccurately. He showed that he often used terms without defining them with perfect distinction, and thereby confused and muddled his argument. It was not economics that formed the precondition of the army or navy, it was, rather, invention, mechanics. The history of warfare was the history of, quote, instruments, the more perfect of which vanquished the less perfect, end quote. Later on in the same chapter, Engels affirmed that in case after case, quote, advances in technique, produced changes in the methods of warfare, end quote. Indeed, force could not be force without machinery, because it was the, quote, instrument of force which helped, quote, force, end quote, to victory, end quote. Lastly, the late 19th century warship was itself an offshoot of the Industrial Revolution, quote, a specimen of modern large-scale industry, end quote. Just as invention had determined the evolution of warfare, so invention had determined the evolution of private property. In the Anti-During, Engels offered an account of the evolution of property throughout the world, quote, all civilized peoples begin with the common ownership of the land, end quote. Engels had alluded to this primitive stage of human development in The Origin. In that work, he characterized this primitive stage as one in which men learned to domesticate animals and to undertake agriculture in settled communities. It was the period of the Gentile Constitution, the period of familial communism, when, quote, all peoples, end quote, passed through this primitive stage. Common ownership of land proved to be a hindrance to increased production. Common ownership was consequently negated and transformed into private property. In The Origin, Engels had also referred to this second stage of development, characterizing it as the period of civilization. Men in this period had developed some basic technological and industrial skills. Men, because of the division of labor that set them out of the household, won exclusive control over productive property, that is, herds and lands. Once the male had gained domination over property, he also brought patriarchic monogamy into existence. The third stage in the history of property was the period of the Communist Revolution. Capitalist private property, in its turn, now proved a deterrent to increase productivity, and therefore would have to be abolished and transcended into a higher form of communal ownership. The laws of the social universe were similar in invariability and predictability to the laws that functioned in the physical universe. Quote, but this distinction, important as it is for historical investigation, particularly of single epochs and events, cannot alter the fact that the course of history is governed by inner general laws, end quote. Engels. In fact, Engels maintained that the transformation of primitive communal property into private property was an illustration of the law of the negation, one of the primary dialectical laws of the cosmos. Thus Engels paralleled the physical universe and the social universe. Just as it had been possible to discover the three basic laws of the natural world, so it would be possible to discover the basic laws of history. Just as it could be shown that the three basic laws of nature function mechanistically, so it could be shown that laws of history necessitated a unilinear evolutionary pattern of growth. Engels' metaphysics of nature had concluded in a metaphysics of history. Even in the 1890s, in the years just before his death, Engels continued to affirm that technology was the most important agent in history. In a famous letter to H. Starkenberg, written on January 25, 1894, Engels sought to explain his view of history. Quote, "What we understand by the economic conditions which we regard as the determining basis of the history of the society..." Sorry, speaking too fast. Quote, "What we understand by the economic conditions which we regard as the determining basis of the history of society are the methods by which human beings in a given society produce their means of subsistence and exchange the products among themselves insofar as the division of labor exists. Thus, the entire technique of production and transport is here included. According to our conception, this technique also determines the method of exchange and further, the division of products, and with it, after the dissolution of tribal society, the division into classes also, and hence the relations of lordship and servitude, and within the state, politics, law, etc." End quote. Engels, in a letter to H. Starkenberg, January 25, 1894. In the paragraph above, Engels affirmed that productive technology was the root influence upon society. The underlying force of societal change were the, quote, "methods," end quote, by which individuals provided for their sustenance, and Engels also found, quote, "technique," end quote, to be the determining agent for legal relations and politics, the societal superstructure. Society for Engels was an inclusive term encompassing ideas, institutions, economics. Nevertheless, in the last analysis, when Engels was seeking the final denominator for economic movement, his vision always fell upon the tools, the instruments, and the machinery of a given society. The, quote, "method of exchange," end quote, quote, "the division of products," end quote, quote, "the relation of lordship and servitude," end quote, were always derivative from technique, from instruments. A similar note was struck by Engels in his September 22, 1892 letter to Danielson. In this letter, Engels was speculating upon the course of development of Russian history. Engels wrote, quote, "Now I maintain that industrial production nowadays means grand industry, or grande industrie." It's like in italics, so I don't know. I guess that's in French. Steam, electricity, self-acting mules, power looms, finally machines that produce machinery. From the day Russia introduced railways, the introduction of these modern means of production was a foregone conclusion. ... If Russia acquired after the Crimean War a grand industry of her own, she could have it in one form only, the capitalist form, and along with that form, she was obliged to take over all the consequences which accompany capitalistic grand industry in all their countries." End quote. Engels, 1892. In the above paragraph, Engels clearly showed that by industry he did not mean a social relationship, but simply machinery. It is clear that Engels understood society to be a complex and multifaceted entity. Men's ideas and legal arrangements, political factors must always be recognized and accounted for when explaining the movement of history. Nevertheless, for Engels, industry was, quote, "steam, electricity, self-acting mules, power looms, finally, machines that produce machinery," end quote. The introduction into a country of one such industrial instrument, i.e. the railroad, made it a, quote, "foregone conclusion," end quote, that the whole plethora of industrial tools would be introduced into that country. In terms of Russia, grand industry required a capitalist form. The introduction of machinery in Russia must produce capitalism. With capitalism and with industry, a proletariat and social misery must also come to Russia. The process was an inevitable process. Technology produced capitalism, technology produced a proletariat, and capitalist technology produced mass pauperization. Having uncovered the basic principles of Engels' view of social development, we can now apply them to two case studies, the history of Germany and the history of Russia. If the foregoing analysis has been correct, if Engels was indeed a social determinist, then we would expect to find that Engels felt both Germany and Russia must follow a unilinear path of evolution, must follow the classical pattern of growth as illustrated by England. It would be expected that Engels saw Germany as having been an underdeveloped country, a country to which the Industrial Revolution came late, but a country that at the end of the 19th century had risen to the leadership of the European socialist movement because the industrialization and capitalization of Germany had been so thorough and deep. In fact, these were exactly Engels' beliefs. It would be expected that Engels saw Russia as another illustration of a backward country, a country that must follow the path of development of England and Western Europe generally, a country that must expect that its ancient agrarian commune, the mirror, would of necessity be destroyed. Such, in fact, was exactly Engels' belief, very different from Marx. In short, Engels' interpretation of German and Russian history conformed perfectly to his social positivism. At the dawn of the modern era, economic conditions in Germany were not as advanced as those of England, France, and Low Countries. By the beginning of the 16th century, Western Europe had already assumed the productive and industrial leadership of European civilization generally. German agriculture lagged behind English and Dutch output. German industry trailed that of the English, the Flemish, and the French. The German population was very sparse. In England and France, commercial and industrial growth had worked to socially and politically centralize these countries. Germany, on the other hand, because of its retarded economic development, remained decentralized. Civilization in Germany existed in isolated areas and scattered centers of industry and commerce. The economic backwardness of Germany strengthened the provincial and local regions, and thus acted as the social foundation for the political power of the German princes. Engels maintained in brief that the origin of German particularism, Germany's developmental stagnation at the level of feudalism, derived from Germany's aborted and delayed economic advancement. The class structure of 16th century Germany mirrored the economic underdevelopment of Central Europe. Nobility and clergy were still the dominant classes. The new 16th century princes had emerged directly out of the old medieval baronry. The new princes had evolved from, had taken the place of, and had adopted the same social and political attitudes as the old baronry. They were simply up-to-date replicas of the bygone feudal lords. In the cities, the dominant class stemmed from the great patrician families, the richest of the town dwellers. They held all the city offices and arbitrarily administered all the revenues of the city. They formed, in fact, a financial and commercial autocracy. The opposition to domination came from a, quote, middle-class opposition, end quote, came from the commercial and financial class of moderate means. This middle-class opposition wanted to participate in the urban legislative process, wanted to share control over the finances of the city. Quote, this moderate, law-abiding, well-off, and intelligent opposition, end quote, fulfilled the same historic role as the Constitutional Party during the revolutionary movement of 1848 to 1849. Indeed, the Constitutional Party of 1848 was the direct, quote, heir, end quote, of the, quote, middle-class opposition, end quote, of the 16th century. Similar to the case of the princes, Engels believed that the constitutional opposition of 1848 had evolved from, taken the place of, and adopted the same political role as the, quote, middle-class opposition, end quote, of the 16th century. Again, Engels had simply paralleled the middle-class dissidents of 1848 to those of 1525 and assumed that the 19th century version had evolved from its 16th century precursor, and that both had demanded the same political reforms. The plebeian opposition to the patrician oligarchy came from the members of former feudal organizations. Cast-off masters from broken guild societies helped make up the plebeian opposition. Journeymen and apprentices were another source of recruitment. Financially ruined members of the middle classes were a third source of supply. It was this plebeian opposition, basically from the broken remnants of guild organizations, that Engels saw as the precursor of the modern proletariat. In the context of the peasant wars of the 16th century, this plebeian opposition followed the political leadership of the, quote, middle-class opposition, end quote. In doing this, it played a similar role to the petit bourgeois of 1848. In the revolutionary epoch, the petite bourgeoisie had also supported the moderate middle classes. Even though the modern industrial proletariat, according to Engels, emerged from the destroyed guild institutions, the bourgeoisie of 1848 and the plebeians of 1525 both allied themselves with the bourgeoisie, thus following an ultimately reactionary policy and thus separating themselves from the revolutionary peasantry as well as from the revolutionary proletariat. Engels again drew an exact parallel between lower middle class activity in 1525 and 1848. This discussion of Engels' analysis of German class structure in the 16th century is important for two reasons. First, it illustrated Engels' method of social analysis. This method can best be described as a search for parallelism, as a search for recurrence. Engels was obviously struck by the fact that opposition to the existing aristocratic order both in 1848 and in 1525 seemingly sprang from middle-class groups and also from plebeian or petty bourgeois groups. By paralleling these two events, by juxtaposing one picture of a historical event against another picture of a historical event, and by noticing a class that appeared to be similar in both pictures, Engels was too easily led to conclude that the modern bourgeoisie evolved directly from the Reformation bourgeoisie, and that both historic middle classes had made exactly parallel political and social demands. From the purely logical point of view, both conclusions are wrong or at least unfounded. From the empirical point of view, Engels did not support either conclusion with persuasive or incontestable historical documentation. The search for recurrence formed the basis of Engels' interpretation of class warfare. In every historical period, there were movements of dissent. Given the fact that from Roman times down to the 19th century, some form of aristocratic order had prevailed in Europe, it was not surprising that middle layers of society wished to increase their political and economic privileges. It was also not surprising that throughout this long span of Western history and alongside the demands of the middle layers, there also developed more extreme demands that were expressive of the interests of the less fortunate in society. However, because of Engels' tendency to think in terms of absolute recurrence, Engels was led to the invalid assumption that the reformist demands of the middle layers of society were always illustrations of middle-class opposition, and that the more extreme demands of the less fortunate in society are always illustrations of proletarian opposition. In other words, Engels' search for absolute parallelism forced him to impose a middle-class proletarian pattern on history. Class struggle in history, seen from the perspective of Engels' parallelism, must always conform to the aristocratic middle-class proletarian pattern. It was a triadic vision of European descent. Engels' style of composition confirms the impression that Engels in an a priori fashion tried to subsume all social descent under the aristocratic middle-class proletarian model. Engels' work in history was never based upon original research. The factual data for the Peasant War in Germany was derived entirely from one secondary source, Wilhelm Zimmermann's The History of the Great Peasant War, published in 1841. The anthropological data for The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State was taken almost completely from Marx's notes on Louis Morgan's Ancient Society. Engels' Revolution and Counter-Revolution was merely a compendium of newspaper articles he wrote for the New York Daily Tribune and was inspired predominantly by his personal experiences during the 1848-49 revolutions. Engels did not write history from documents. Engels was not an empirical historian, sifting through a welter of evidence in order to arrive at a scientific and private synthesis. Engels' talent lay in exposition. Fortified with a lucid style, Engels was an excellent narrator. Engels did not present a new vision, but rather offered a readable exposition of complex events. It was, in essence, superior journalism. I think this is kind of like, that kind of like characterization of like Engels' talents and Engels' limitations is rather common. Like, for instance, I read a book titled, the book was The Very Short Introduction to Engels by Terrell Carver, and if you don't know who Terrell Carver is, he's written a lot on Marxism. He also, I think, is a co-editor of the series, which I don't know if it exists anymore, but it was a series with Palgrave titled Marx, Engels, and Marxisms. I think he co-edited that with Marcelo Musto. So Terrell Carver is like a big deal in the world of like Marx commentary. And one of the things, he wrote a big fat, what am I saying? He wrote the very short introduction, which is not big and fat, the very short introduction to Engels with the Oxford University Press series, the very short introduction series. And he kind of says the same thing, is that he's, like, Engels' primary talent was, like, as a gloss, someone who could, like, write kind of, like, easily understood expositions of other ideas, and also as a journalist were his main contributions, were his main talents that he brought forward. In terms of like original philosophical or economic thought, those were not his talents, and those were not his trainings. But I guess it's a different thing. I guess that's the limitations of trying to be like a Renaissance man, which a lot of Marxists like attempt to be, is like a Renaissance person, right? Someone who tries to have an answer for all questions and dabbles in all things. You dabble in anthropology, you dabble in science, you dabble in economics, you dabble in history, you do journalism, you do political philosophy, whatever. You do all these things, and eventually you're going to run into some pretty serious limitations. And someone who has more time and training to dedicate to any one of those areas is probably going to outsmoke you. But at the same time, there's very much something to be said for that Renaissance type approach of like seeking like total knowledge and synthesizing information from disparate fields. So, you know, both specialization and non-specialization are gifts and curses in their own ways. Oh, that's coffee's good. Christ. Engels also saw his mission in life to be in his abilities best expressed in the application of the Marxian dialectical method as he understood that method. In the realm of natural sciences, Engels sought to apply dialectics to physics, chemistry, and biology. In the same way, Engels sought to apply the dialectical method to past epochs of history. What resulted from this application was merely the superimposition of the aristocratic bourgeois proletarian model in all past history. Engels' history then did not expose the unique. We are not confronted with nuances. We are not shown the differences between the late feudal middle classes and the modern capitalistic middle classes. We are not shown the different mechanisms of social domination of exploitation in the 16th and 19th centuries, and thus we are left uninformed as to the differences in social relationship and social meaning in the comparative sociology of master-slave interrelations. Engels did not submit proof, but rather a formula. He accepted the Marxian triadic model, which Marx reserved for and restricted to the 19th century, and which Engels sought to universalize that format. For example, Engels' method of parallelism, the juxtaposing of an unemployed journeyman beside a factory worker, predisposed him to see the modern proletariat as a direct outgrowth of the 16th century working man. Engels' history of the rise of the modern working class was different from Marx's analysis. Marx never equated capitalism with materiality. Quote, "Money and commodities are not from the first capital," end quote, he wrote in Das Kapital. Tools, factories, the entire technique of production, rates of interest, the credit system were not in themselves sufficient to produce a capitalist system. Capitalism was not a thing and an object, it was a social relationship. The peculiar meaning, according to Marx, of capitalist social relationships was domination due to the purchase of labor. Capitalism was the commoditization of labor and therefore the subjection of the individual laborer. In order, then, for a full capitalist society to come into existence, the great mass of the population must be separated from the opportunity to produce their own sustenance. They must be divorced from the tools of production and be driven to sell their labor, thus life, on the marketplace, to be proletarianized. In Marx's account, recruitment into the ranks of the proletariat followed a, quote, agricultural revolution, end quote. Capitalism in the West developed only after the massive and forcible migrations of the, quote, agricultural revolution, end quote. The peasant, the serf, must be separated from the soil and come to the city in the guise of a commodity. For Marx, the industrial proletariat was recruited from the displaced agricultural worker. For Engels, the industrial proletariat evolved directly out of the ruined guild members. This is fucking fascinating. This is fascinating to me because this is like, if you are familiar at all with like 20th century debates about the origins of capitalism from in like the Marxist vernacular, whether it's like the Dobbs-Sweezy debate or the Brenner debate, political Marxism and its critics, you know, Ellen Mason's Wood, George Kamenel, Charles Post, Andrew Zmolik, some guy who does work on France. All these people are kind of like, a big thing with like, at least the Brenner debate, is like whether capitalism really emerges in the countryside and in the towns. And a lot of like conventional historical materialism kind of like talks about how like really it has an urban focus on the origins of capitalism. And the political Marxists, especially Brenner, and I can't remember, I think it was Dobb who pushed for the idea, not Sweezy. I think it was Dobb. I may be wrong about that, who in like in the 1940s and 50s really pushed the idea that capitalism has its genesis in the countryside. And I think Brenner kind of elaborated on that debate. And so if you listen to like the audiobook I have on like Ellen Mason's Wood, who's coming from that Brenner-ist tradition, she also says the same thing is about like how like property relations and class conflict in the countryside between like lords, tenant farmers, and so forth, and the introduction of market compulsion in the countryside was the precondition for the development of capitalism, or in fact maybe even was capitalism once that kind of universalized market dependence was more or less established. And so this is like this idea, this passage here about the distinction between Marx and Engels on the genesis of capitalism is fucking extremely fascinating, and I wonder what people who are more steeped in Marxian historical sociology than I would have to say about this. Anyway, furthermore, Marx never argued by parallelism. In the Grundrisse, Marx devoted many pages to a discussion of Asiatic, primitive Russian, or slave societies. He did so not only to discover the immanent economic relationships of these societies, but also the essential economic relationship by comparison of capitalist society. Economic relationships differed greatly from society to society, and the people who were caught in those economic relationships also differed. Marx was not simply concerned with the general category of underprivileged, the pauper. Marx was more concerned with the uniqueness, the separateness of the poor under the economic relationship of feudalism as compared to the poor under a totally different economic relationship known as capitalism. It would never have occurred to Marx that the feudal poor would act in the same way or think in the same terms as the capitalist poor. From the perspective of Engels' vision of German history, the coming of the Reformation into an economically backward Germany, into a Germany with its singular class and political structure, culminated in the further decentralization of the country. Ultimately, according to Engels, the princes were the chief victors of the Reformation, and after the peasant wars in Germany and the Kleinstaaterei took a 300-year hold on the country. Engels here in the peasant wars was Thomas Müntzer. He was not only the religious radical, but the revolutionary leader. The man who symbolized compromise, who allowed himself to be co-opted by the princes, was Martin Luther. When Luther turned his back on the peasantry in 1525, Luther's treachery worked only to strengthen the domination of the feudal aristocracy. Engels maintained that the, quote, parallel between the German revolutions of 1525 and 1848-49 was too obvious to be left entirely without attention, end quote. In both instances, the upper and middle bourgeoisie joined with the nobility to suppress the revolutionaries. The long history of bourgeois reaction, of bourgeois opposition to the proletariat was thus established. Both in 1848 and 1525, the petty bourgeoisie proved an untrustworthy ally of the revolutionary elements. Engels said of the petty bourgeoisie that, quote, this class is entirely unreliable, end quote, and more often than not would join with the enemies of the revolution. Similarly, the proletariat and the peasantry were disunified in 1848 and 1525, and Engels wrote the peasant war in Germany as a plea for the unity of peasant and worker in the next German revolution. Just as Germany was not ripe for revolution in 1525, so she was not ripe for revolution in 1848. Again, the cause was industrial backwardness. Indeed, industry had grown rapidly in Germany after 1815, and the Zollverein helped the spread of manufacture. I'm not sure what the Zollverein was. I think it might have been like prior to the German unification in 1870 or whatever, 1871. I think there was like kind of like a informal kind of like trade agreement amongst German principalities, and that might be what Zollverein refers to, but I'm not sure. I'm gonna sit in the sun for a while. Sitting in the sun is less annoying than sitting here. My neighbor cut his lawn. Where am I? Nevertheless, German manufacture still trailed that of England and France. Consequently, the bourgeoisie was also less advanced and powerful in Germany than either in England or in France. In England, the middle classes had conquered political power in 1688, while in France they had conquered power in 1789. In Germany, the middle classes were still excluded from the exercise of political power. The industrial backwardness of Germany not only retarded the development of the German manufacturing and commercial classes, but also that of the German proletariat. Again, the German proletariat was far behind that of England and France, but the spread of the working class movement could never be complete until after the conquest of power by the bourgeoisie. The future success of the proletariat was dependent upon the present success of the bourgeoisie. It was only after the more progressive wing of the bourgeoisie, the large manufacturers, took political power and fashioned the state in accordance with their own needs that a large working class would develop, and the, quote, inevitable conflict, end quote, between employer and employee became, quote, imminent, end quote. 1 second. Okay, I just want to make sure I was still recording. Last night I was recording something and it like crapped out on me. Where the hell am I? Sorry, I might have to reread some things. The industrial backwardness of Germany not only retarded the development of the German manufacturing commercial classes, but also that of the German proletariat. Again, the German proletariat was far behind that of England and France, but the spread of the working class movement could never be complete until after the conquest of power by the bourgeoisie. The future success of the proletariat was dependent upon the present success of the bourgeoisie. It was only after the more progressive wing of the bourgeoisie, the large manufacturers, took political power and fashioned the state in accordance with their own needs that a large working class would develop, and the, quote, inevitable conflict, end quote, between employer and employee became, quote, imminent, end quote. Imminent as in like soon approaching, not imminent as in like internal to. The chief culprits in the defeat of the 1848 to 1849 revolution were the middle classes and the petty bourgeoisie. The middle classes, frightened by the thunder from the left, allied themselves to the aristocracy. Thereby they succeeded in destroying the proletarian revolution, but they also succeeded in destroying their own chances for power. The aristocracy again emerged in 1848 as it had in 1525 as the chief victors of the revolution, and the German bourgeoisie was to continue as before, a politically powerless class, a class that would fulfill its role as an addendum to the feudality. Because of this bourgeois failure, Germany would never experience a liberal revolution. The chief victims of the debacle of 1848 were, of course, the German proletariat and, of equal importance, German nationalism. Since the bourgeoisie in England and France had been the driving force of English and French nationalism, and since the German bourgeoisie remained an appendage of the Teutonic nobility, it was not surprising that Germany itself remained divided along the lines of princely Kleinstaaterei. In 1848, the revolutionary proletariat was perhaps the main driving force for national unity, but its defeat was also the defeat of national unification. Thus, the cause of German nationalism did not reach fulfillment in either its bourgeois form or its proletarian form. The cause of nationalism in Germany must wait, therefore, for Junkerdom to co-opt it for the purpose of monarchical preservation. Just as the force of Italian nationalism could not be stopped in 1859, so the force of German nationalism was not completely destroyed by the defeat of 1848. Rather, its principal agent changed from the German bourgeoisie to the Prussian aristocracy. The War of 1866, a civil war, witnessed the end of the German Confederation and the beginning of the end of German Kleinstaaterei. Quote, 1866 was a complete revolution, end quote. German dualism was destroyed and Prussian hegemony established in Central Europe. Bismarck had usurped but nevertheless fulfilled the historic task of the bourgeoisie. In terms of political realism, however, it was only Prussia who could play Savoy. It was only Prussia that possessed the needed military power and national coherence to achieve unification. The liberal democratic road had proven to be a failure. Quote, German unity under Austria's wing was a romantic dream, end quote. As Austria was both bound to the petty princes as well as too deeply involved in the Balkans, only the third way remained, unification under Prussia. This position had been advocated by Engels as early as 1842. In 1866, he was to see its political realization. His excellent sense of political realism was confirmed. Engels' basic criticism of the accomplishment of 1866 was that Bismarck had not been revolutionary enough. Since the revolution had come from the top, it had only been half a revolution, and Bismarck's creation had not destroyed the aristocracy, but rather subsumed them under the Prussian Empire. Not only had the German bourgeoisie seen its mission preempted by its aristocratic enemy, but it had also witnessed its constitutional mission destroyed by that same enemy. Force had made the North German Confederation, and force had also made the Bismarckian Constitution of 1866. What emerged from all these events was not the old Prussian Frederikian state, nor the Manchester state of England. What emerged was something else, the Bonapartist state, which first took historical form under Napoleon III. According to Engels, the Bonapartist state was Bismarck's gift to Germany after the Revolution of 1871. Ever the political realist, Engels, although he understood the reactionary nature of the Bismarckian settlement, nevertheless felt that the Hohenzollern denouncement was a progressive step within the politico-social conditions of Central Europe. The victory of 1871 was merely the logical outcome of a process that had begun in 1848. The incapacity of the German bourgeoisie simply meant that Bismarck had completed their historic mission for them. The Prussian Empire had uprooted the relics of feudalism in Central Europe. National unity had been achieved. It was Engels' belief that no widespread workers' movement, no true proletarian revolutionary movement could make headway in Germany without the existence of a national state. Bismarck, for Engels, was both victor and dupe. He was victor because he had preempted the mission of the bourgeoisie. He was dupe because he unwittingly created the fundamental prerequisites for a proletarian movement. Although national unity had been achieved, the Revolution of 1871 had not been a national revolution. It had proceeded on the basis of monarchical imperialism. After 1866, Germany had become a protectorate of Prussia. In 1871, Prussia had simply annexed the remaining portions of Germany. The Prussian crown had militarily imposed unity, and through that military imposition had Prussianized Germany. From the diplomatic point of view, it was Engels' belief that the basic flaw in the new Prussian Empire had been the incorporation of Alsace-Lorraine. By means of that acquisition, Bismarck had sown the seeds of future war. French animosity toward Germany was now a given. France must seek an ally. German annexation of Alsace-Lorraine had driven France into the arms of Russia. Furthermore, a Franco-Russian alliance made Russia the arbiter of Europe. Because of her military potential, in possession of an ally in Western Europe, Russia would emerge as the dominant power on the continent. Russian dominance on the continent also meant the dominance of the forces of conservatism. The Prussian conquest of Germany had brought unity to Germany, but not diplomatic stability to Europe. In Engels' eyes, the Franco-Prussian War had another important consequence. The center of the European labor movement had shifted to Germany. The defeat of the Paris Commune and the lack of real trade union militants in England, the rapid industrialization of Germany meant that the center of European socialism lay in Germany. The German workers had demonstrated their proletarian idealism by forthrightly denouncing the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine. They had wanted peace without annexation, although defending Germany and recognizing Napoleon III as aggressor in the War of 1870. For all these reasons, plus the fact that the German working class was rapidly increasing numerically, Germany after 1871 had become the vanguard of the European proletarian movement. Engels' description of the course of German history was determinist. It was deterministic because the lateness of the liberal revolution in Germany derived from the retarded economic growth of Germany. The weakness of the German bourgeoisie derived from the weakness in the first half of the century of German industry. The failures of the German bourgeoisie in 1848 and 1866 were therefore deducible from the thinness and paucity of German technological development. The constitutional debacle of the liberals in 1870 to 71 was also predicated upon the technological backwardness of Germany. But after 1870, industrial growth mushroomed through Germany. It mushroomed from the cities to the countryside, and therefore it surpassed in thoroughness and intensity the industrialization of England and France. Consequently, there were more German workers, and the German labor movement assumed the leadership of the West. Germany had imitated the pattern of development of France and England. Of course, there was a certain uniqueness to German history. Germany developed later than England and France. Because of this late development, German unification differed from that of England and France. Certain specific laws of development could coexist inside the unilinear pattern. But the general line of development recapitulated the French and English experience. Technology had required Germany to have a liberal revolution, even though a belated one. Technology required Germany to achieve national unity, even though belated. Technology required Germany to experience the conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie. Even though the bourgeois elements had amalgamated with aristocratic elements, Germany had copied the pattern of the West European countries. Excuse me. The ideas and attitudes Engels applied to the study of German history, he also applied to the analysis of Russian society. Just as Engels concluded that Germany must follow the path of Western development, so Engels believed that Russia too must copy the developmental pattern of the West. After defeat in the Crimean War, even the Tsar realized that Russia must be modernized. In 1861, the emancipation of the serfs opened the dikes to social reform. Expectantly, Western European as well as Russian socialists began to speculate on when and how revolution would come to Imperial Russia. However, the Russian populace felt that the Mir, a village commune, could serve as the basis for an immediate transition to communism after the Tsar had been overthrown. Maintaining that it was not necessary for Russia to move from feudalism to capitalism to communism, the Narodniks were considered by Engels to be anti-Marxist since they did not understand dialectical materialism. Since Russia would indeed necessarily have to pass from feudalism to capitalism to communism, the path to communism could only move in a mono-developmental line. The Mir, for Engels, did not possess unqualified virtue. In fact, Engels assumed that it represented a lower stage in the development of civilization. Similar thoughts were expressed by Engels as late as 1894 in his concluding remarks to Socialis aus Russland, where Engels indicated that the Russian village commune was merely a vestige of the ancient Gentile constitution. But the Gentile system had either already been overthrown or was in the process of decay all over the world. For instance, the gens had been eradicated in Europe. Its place had been taken by the capitalist order. Just as in the origin of the family, private property, and the state, Engels could say that the, quote, Gentile constitution was absolutely irreconcilable with money economy, end quote. So he could argue that the Mir would be inevitably destroyed by industrial capitalism. The Russian Narodniks were wrong, and Engels never tired of making this point. But one detects in Engels' assault upon the populace not merely a squabble over socialist theory and dogma. This is not a Marxian internecine struggle. Rather, one hears overtones of Engels' anti-Slavism. Engels accused the Narodniks of being pan-Slavists. Engels hated pan-Slavism, seeing it as a tool of Tsarist imperialism. But he also hated pan-Slavism because it was a form of Slavic imperial nationalism. There is, then, in this struggle between the German Engels and the Slavic Narodniks, the ancient antipathy between Teuton and Slav badly disguised in the form of dialectical materialism. Not only was it necessary to have capitalism before communism, but for Engels it was also just as indispensable for a bourgeois and proletarian class to exist before communism became a realistic possibility. Quote, this requires not only a proletariat that carries out this revolution, but also a bourgeoisie in whose hands the productive forces of society have developed so far that they allow the final destruction of class distinctions, ... The bourgeoisie, therefore, in this respect also is just as necessary a condition of the socialist revolution as the proletariat itself. Hence a man who will say that this revolution can be more easily carried out in a country because although it has no proletariat, it has no bourgeoisie either, only proves that he has still to learn the ABC of socialism, end quote. Engels. Only the industrial proletariat could produce communism. Only the industrial proletariat, because of the wage slavery it had suffered, had attained a communist consciousness. That is, because of capitalist exploitation, only a proletarian revolution could be a communist revolution. However, the proletariat itself was a product of large-scale industry. The existence, then, of the bourgeoisie was a necessary precondition for the existence of the proletariat. It was the historic task of the bourgeoisie to develop the factory system to a high capacity, and thus create those conditions that gave rise to the industrial working class. Engels' monodevelopmentalism was thus composed of three stages. On the historic level, all societies must pass from private communism to feudalism to capitalism. From the perspective of social classes and corresponding exactly with the three prior historic stages, all societies must undergo the class rule of the gens, the aristocracy, and the bourgeoisie. Only after this third stage had been completed, only after capitalism and the bourgeoisie-proletariat class conflict existed, was it possible to advance to the fourth stage, the stage of communism and a classless society. Engels was aware, of course, that in the 19th century Russia was ready for revolution. The Crimean War had been a turning point. It had forced Russia to seek to overcome her backwardness by capitalist industrialization and compelled her to free the serfs. Both events were severely straining the traditional structure of Russia and were indeed bringing the Tsarist system to the point of collapse. The revolution in Russia, according to Engels, would not be a communist revolution. Russia did not possess a fully developed capitalist system nor a large proletariat, and thus could not progress to the fourth stage of evolution. But a Russian revolution in the East would spark a proletarian revolution in the West. Although Russia was not ready for communism, a Russian revolution would precipitate a communist revolution in the West, where conditions were ripe for proletarian uprising. Only after a successful communist revolution in the West could the Russian Revolution advance to communism. A Western communist revolution was a necessary precondition for Russian communist revolution. The technological skills, the industrial power, the proletarian consciousness of the West were needed in order to help support Russia on its path to communism. In this sense, a communist society must be imported to Russia. While the beginning of revolution in Russia would be indigenous, the creation of a communist society in Russia would come from outside. In his thinking on the possibilities of revolution in Russia, Engels also worked within a unilinear framework. Backward countries must follow the path of the West, must imitate the stages of development already traversed by the more advanced, the higher civilization of Western Europe. By using Germany and Russia as case studies, Engels' understanding of the historic process has been clarified. Engels viewed history as a deterministic, unilinear evolutionary process. The basic, primary motivating force in all societies was technological growth. Using technological growth as a measure, societies could be ranked on the evolutionary scale from lower to higher. Because the logic of technological invention was additive, sequential, there existed in history a necessary order of development of technology and therefore a necessary order of societies as well. As technology advanced, societies would deterministically move up the evolutionary ladder from primitive communism to feudalism to capitalism to communism. The part of the world to first embark upon this necessary order of development was Western Europe. This was, of course, the general march of world history. But Engels is aware that local specific variations could exist. Clearly, the specific histories and destinies of Russia and Germany varied. Thus, Engels' theory allowed for temporary local differentiation. In terms of the concrete historical moment, societal uniqueness and distinctiveness were present. Marxism, Engels asserted, was not a formula. The point at issue here, however, is the overall movement and progress of history. Engels believed Russia and Germany would inevitably become communist, each in its own way. The general pattern of history then was given, and in broad terms it was a system of inevitable stages of evolution. By the 1890s, Engels' major work lay behind him. His creative energies were spent, yet he had reached the apogee of his fame. He carried on a voluminous correspondence, responding to people who had requested further clarification of his ideas, people who assumed that Engels' ideas were exactly similar to Marx's ideas. The letters of the 1890s were the letters of an old man who was reviewing a lifetime of work and effort. They might be seen as reminiscences, as a summary or introduction to 50 years of arduous intellectual labor. They were distillations, crystals of what Engels conceived to be the essentials of his work and are therefore vitally important. Primarily, Engels sought to defend Marx and himself against the charge that their doctrine completely eliminated the role of ideas in history. Above all, Engels did not wish to advocate a form of positivism that completely negated the determining agency of human thought. Engels did not wish to eradicate mind in favor of physiology. Even though Engels accepted the copy theory of knowledge, once ideas had been placed into the mind, then mind responded to these ideas rather than solely to instinct or learned behavior. Engels believed in human rationality. Engels defined one aspect of communist society as the rational and conscious control of the forces of production. Ideas for Engels thus played an important role in history, and any description of a society must take them into account, but the question is the degree of the causal determinacy of ideas. Since Engels did advocate a determining agency for ideas in history, some have interpreted this as proof that Engels was never a positivist. Such a conclusion appears to be unwarranted. In fact, the letters of 1890 demonstrate the endurance of his positivism. Engels worked within the framework of the substructure-superstructure dichotomy. Law, art, politics, culture belonged to the realm of the superstructure. It was possible, once this realm of ideas had originated in the substructure, once they had taken on an existence independent of the substructure, to react back on the substructure. it was possible for ideas to have a determining impact on the realm of the economic. Engels had not changed or altered his position in the 1890s. He had merely clarified beliefs that he had always maintained. However, the realm of ideas was a determining agent only on a secondary level for Engels. Quote, and if this man has not yet discovered that while the material mode of existence is the premium agens, or agens, A-G-I-N-S, primary agent, prime cause, this does not preclude the ideological spheres from reacting upon it in their turn, though with a secondary effect, end quote. In the passage of history, Engels believes substructure and superstructure interacted, the ideological and the economic interpenetrated. But in the last analysis, the substructure assumed primary causal power. The economic realm possessed causal priority, a predominance of determination. Quote, there is an interaction of all these elements in which, amid all the endless host of accident, Sorry, there's a lanternfly on me. Where am I? Sorry, I got spaced out there. Quote, and if this man has not yet discovered... Yeah. All right, stay safe. Don't spread the plague. Oh, well, I'll text her. I'll see you guys. In the passage of history, Engels believed structure and superstructure interacted, the ideological and economic interpenetrated, but in the last analysis, the substructure assumed primary causal power. The economic realm possessed causal priority, a predominance of determination. Quote, there is an interaction of all these elements in which, amid all the endless host of accident, that is, of things and events whose interconnection is so remote or so impossible of proof that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary, end quote. Engels. Although ideas did influence history, although one must be aware of this and watch for the impact of ideas, the fundamental determining agent in history was still the economic. It was here that we must look for the ultimate causality, for the ultimate meaning of history. Far from removing us from the imprisoning clutches of the economic, Engels' letters of 1890 reaffirmed the preeminence of the techno-economic realm. By making economics the primary causal agent, by seeing ideas themselves as being caused by the techno-economic substructure, Engels remained in the camp of positivism. Quote, men make their history themselves, but not as yet with a collective will or according to a collective plan or even in a definitely defined given society. Their efforts clash, and for that very reason all such societies are governed by necessity, which is supplemented by and appears under the form of accident. The necessity which here asserts itself amidst all accident is again ultimately economic necessity, end quote. The notion of human praxis was absent from Engels' historical speculations. Marx's view of history was an anthropocentric view of history, with man as the activating principle, who interacted with reality in order to modify, in order to construct. Engels lacked this anthropocentric vision of man. The subject of history for Engels was nature, or technological forces or some larger agency external to man. That which predicated, was always some abstract economic or natural power outside of man. A parallel existed between Engels' view of nature and his view of history. Matter in motion, forces far beyond the control of the human being, exercise dominion in the physical universe. Technology and economics, potencies also beyond the control of the human agent, assumed causal priority in the social universe. In both instances, man was primarily object, primarily respondent. As we have seen, Engels understood neither the Hegelian left nor the naturalistic basis of Feuerbachian philosophy. Lacking the Hegelian notion of thought as an active critical agent, lacking the Feuerbachian notion of a world created from alienated human essence, Engels could never develop the idea of praxis. Without the notion of praxis, Engels saw history as unfolding according to laws extrinsic to man, while Marx saw history as unfolding according to powers intrinsic to human labor. Marx believed in immanence, Engels in emanation. Engels' concentration on the extrinsic, on the forces that emanated from outside of man, led Engels to judge causal factors solely in terms of materiality. For Engels, social relations, like kinship grouping, social customs, and mores, were never productive forces, did not determine history. Productive forces were always concrete materiality, like machines, money, herds, population. Engels always reduced cause to physicality, to concrete presence, and never to the complex web of human interrelationships. As a correlate of his general positivism, only an object had reality, and his view of historical causality corresponded perfectly with the positivist 19th century interpenetration of causality. Marx, on the other hand, had a completely different notion of historical causality. Marx did not think in terms of linear progression. Rather, Marx thought in terms of the inherent structure of a given society. Every society was a unique composite, a totality. Marx's vision was a holistic vision, which was founded on the assumption that every social organism was composed of different formal content. Therefore, every social totality would function in accordance with its own inherent structure. Rather than look for sequence, Marx looked for mutation. Marx looked for the indigenous structure of a social organism, the conflict between form and content in that structure, and the splitting of that totality because of its inherent faults. Causality for Marx did not mean linear accumulation. Causality for Marx meant the kind of movement, the kind of growth that was open to a social structure with a particular kind of constitution. Like Hegel, Marx thought of causality as relation. Marx's view of social development was anatomical. The view of Engels was modeled upon physics. Engels accepted the model of the predominant science of his day. Marx made the statement that, quote, human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape, end quote. Marx looked upon societies as organisms, as totalities. Of course, organisms were transformed. One societal totality followed another societal totality. But the transformation of a social organism depended on its internal structure and the relation of that structure to the surrounding world. The relation of that organism to its own internal content and to its historical environment was unique, was singular. Marx's multilinear view of history did not mean that there was no development in history. Rather, it meant that the development was not inevitable, that each pattern of evolution must be worked out in its own terms. On the other hand, Engels was a linear necessitarian. All societies must pass through successive stages. Progress was defined by Engels as the successful passage through these stages. Engels is wedded to a traditional 19th century view of causality. For Engels, causality meant necessary succession. His view was linear and additive. If the necessary cause of B was A, then the necessary cause of C must be B. Engels thought it in terms of a string of beads, where it was impossible to add any bead without the necessary prior beads being present. Explanation for Engels meant the linear juxtaposition of sequential events. Causality for Engels meant additive sequence. It was not surprising that Engels adopted a unilinear view of history. If explanation meant necessary succession, then the way to explain in history was by means of necessary succession. Engels saw history as additive and cumulative sequence, capitalism following feudalism and communism following capitalism. The Marxian notion of causality, then, when superimposed upon the historical process, meant that Marx was a multilinearist. Because causality for Marx meant movement relative to the internal structure of a social totality, the developmental path of most societies would differ because the internal structure of most societies would. Unilinearism was foreign to the very spirit of Marx. Correctly understood, the Marxian view of history did not maintain that all societies had to follow the path of feudalism, capitalism, communism. Western Europe had indeed followed such a path, but Western society was only one social totality. Furthermore, causality to Marx was not synonymous with materiality. Marx believed that social forces could be productive forces, that social forces could help shape the structure of society. By a social force, Marx understood not materiality, but relationships. Marx meant the relationships between man and man, or the relationships between man and the means of productivity. A particular mode of interhuman relationship could be a productive force, that is, could modify and shape the structure of society. This is not to deny that Marx ascribed causal priority when accounting for social change to the means of production. The argument presented here is solely intended to refute the claim that Marx thought the means of production and only the means of production were sufficient to induce social movement. Marx's concern for social forces and interhuman relationships as productive influences again illustrates his anthropocentric view of history. Because of his concern for man as an active critical agent, Marx could never assert that human interrelationships were non-productive. If man is his praxis, if history is the autogenesis of man, then the social forms man creates, the customs and mores man lives under, must contribute to his self-creation. The Marxian theme of historic immanence focused his attention not only on individual praxis, but social praxis. In short, social praxis was a part of historical autogenesis. Conversely, Engels developed a metaphysics of history. Engels thought of historical change as an epiphenomenon of economic development. Engels' major concern was the factors of causality extrinsic to human labor. Engels had not participated in the Marxian anthropocentric revolution of the social sciences. Engels was guilty of idealizing materiality. Engels' metaphysical materialism led Engels to see history as ruled by deterministic material forces. Engels' materialism became essentially a form of idealism. By claiming that only the physical had reality, Engels slipped into dogmatism. In the next chapter, we noted how Engels did away with philosophy. Because Engels did not understand the critico-creative aspect of thought, he simply replaced active consciousness with positivist science. Mind for Engels was what science had empirically verified. In the same way, Engels did away with history. Engels replaced history through the study of economics and technology. In the hands of Engels, history was no longer the study of the unique, the multifarious, but rather the compilation of economic data. History is not the story of human deeds, but rather the quantitative description of technological inventions. Engels' tendency to view technological growth as the basic determining factor in history has been discussed in earlier sections of this work. In Chapter 9, we saw how Engels explained the use of capitalism, the rise of a proletariat, as a consequence of the rise of large industry. The thought patterns that he manifested as a mature man were already present in the young man who first attempted to interpret English society and history. The continuity of his thought is clear. It was not that Engels was unaware of the ideational. It was not that Engels was unaware of the social. Engels took into account these factors and weighed these factors, but there was in Engels a predisposition of mind. There were mental presuppositions. Thus, after weighing all the factors, Engels invariably stressed, focused upon, found the center of gravity in materiality and industrial growth. This predisposition formed the foundation of what is referred to in these pages as Engelsism. That's the end of the chapter. Now I'm going to read the endnotes, which are called footnotes, but they're not footnotes if they're at the foot of the page, right? Doesn't that make sense? Isn't footnotes when it's on the page? You immediately have the reference right in front of your face? Two articles that are, so here, footnote 1. Two articles that I've written deal with the question of primitive society in the thought of Marx and Engels, anthropology in the thought of Marx and Engels in Studies in Comparative Communism, and Dialectical Materialism and the Mirror in the Berkeley Journal of Sociology. Friedrich Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Engels Anti-Düring, Engels Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. For further clarification of Engels' philosophy of history, see Z.A. Jordan's The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, 1960. Engels' letter to H. Starkenberg, January 25th, 1894, and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Selected Correspondence, New York International Publishers, 1942. Engels to Danielson, September 22nd, 1892. Marx and Engels correspondence. Engels, The Peasant War in Germany, Marx Das Kapital, translated by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling. Engels, Germany, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in The German Revolutions, edited by Leonard Krieger with University of Chicago Press, 1967. A letter from Engels to Babel, November 18th, 1884, in Marx Engels Selected Correspondence. Engels, The Role of Force in History, translated by Jack Cohen, International Publishers, 1968. For further clarification of Engels' attitude to Prussia and its role in German unification, see Chapter 9 of this book. Engels, The Housing Question, edited by C.P. Dutt, International Publishers, 1950. Engels to Danielson, October 17th, 1893. Engels, Flüchtlingsliteratur, actually, probably. Engels, Russia and the Social Revolution Reconsidered in The Russian Menace to Europe, edited by Paul W. Blackstock and Bert F. Hoselitz, The Free Press, 1952. Engels, On Social Relations in Russia. Engels, Russia and the Social Revolutions Reconsidered. Engels to Conrad Schmidt, October 27th, 1890. A very insightful discussion of Engels' philosophy of history, Leonard Krieger's introduction in The German Revolutions. Other insights into Engels' mentality are suggested by Ernest Mandel in The Formation of the Economic Thought of Karl Marx, translated by Brian Pierce, with Monthly Review Press in 1971. In addition, the differences between Marx and Engels over the question of the evolution of Russia are ably discussed by A. Wilicki, Controversy over Capitalism, Oxford Clarendon Press, 1969. A letter from Engels to V. Bloch, September 21st, 1890. Engels to Conrad Schmidt, August 5th, 1890. Engels to V. Bloch, September 21st, 1890. Engels to Starkenberg, January 25th, 1894. And Marx Grundrisse. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for bearing with my hacking and wheezing, it's shuffling around and all of that. Have a good one.